Hello, we're going to give everybody a few minutes just to get settled and get into the room, and then we will start our transplant talk. Okay. First, I want to say thank you to everyone for coming tonight and for being here to listen to our presentation about emotions and coping after transplant. My name is Patty Draper. I'm the director of the Transplant Mentors program at Gift of Life, and I'll be facilitating this discussion this evening. First, I'd like to introduce anybody who hasn't known of Gift of Life in the past, a little bit about us as an organization. Gift of Life is a local nonprofit with a national reach that promotes and supports awareness and success of organ, eye, and tissue donation. We do this through two signature programs, and the Transplant Mentors program is one of those. We're offered nationwide, and we pair trained mentors with transplant recipients, their care partners, and potential living donors to provide insight, education, support, and encouragement through the transplant process. Tonight, we have two of our mentors and the spouse of one of our mentors. Karen Martin is with us this evening. Karen received a liver transplant in 2020. Before her transplant even, she was hospitalized 11 times in 15 months, so a really difficult pre-transplant course. Karen has a large family whom she really loves spending time with, retired educator, lover of knowledge, and we were just discussing our love of road trips. She's joined by her husband, Jim. He is a retired Navy commander and aerospace engineer. He'll be joining us in just a second. He enjoys participating in the American Legion Band, is an avid bicycler, lover of road trips, coffee, and of course, Karen. And then Amber, I learned today, is an avid cycler herself and completed her first century ride, which is so exciting. She received a kidney transplant in 2015 after being on dialysis nearly 2 years. She now lives in Nashville, Tennessee with her two fur babies, Tinkerbell and Princeton. She's also, like I said, a lover of cycling and travel. She also spends a good deal of her time volunteering and advocating for people with end-stage renal disease. So I just want to take a moment and say thanks, guys, for joining us and sharing your knowledge and expertise. We appreciate it. Today, we're going to be discussing a lot about the stress during transplant. I think we all know and are aware that transplantation is a very wonderful thing, but it also can be a really hard thing to live through, whether it's as the intended recipient, a living donor, or a care partner, someone who takes care of you, kind of the home team, your loved ones that take care of you outside the hospital. Today, we're going to be discussing examples of those stressors with our transplant mentors here today. Stress is one of those terms I think we throw around a lot, but when we look at the definition of stress through a medical lens, it really is defined as the body's response to physical, mental, or emotional pressure or extra burden. It's not uncommon for people to think that after transplantation, maybe your stress level would go down significantly because the waiting is over. It's important to remember that the transplant surgery is the beginning of a really long journey as well. Transplantation is, as we know, a treatment for disease, not a cure. And so you'll still be a consumer of medical care to some extent, and transplantation, while wonderful, also can come with its stressors and complications. And post-transplant stress has been documented to impact adherence to treatment, which can in turn impact transplant outcomes, how well your organ functions in the future. So it's always really important to not ignore the mental health aspect of your care. So first, we're going to ask our panel to kind of discuss some medical stressors. When we think of medical stressors, we understand that When we talk about undue burden or stress, that your body undergoing a big surgery is a really wonderful example of that. Research shows that patients can really affect their outcomes of their transplant by their ability to manage their stress and how well they cope. I think a big element of this is the idea of self-advocacy, asking for help when you need it, asking for clarification or additional information. Amber, you had mentioned that self-advocacy has been a big part of your healthcare journey. I wondered if you share a little bit about what self-advocacy means to you as it applies to a long-term relationship with healthcare providers.
I guess I'll start.
Karen, I'm going to let Amber answer real quick.
Oh, okay.
She asked Amber.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I didn't hear that Amber part. She's muted.
Amber, did you hear my question?
There we go. I was muted and I couldn't unmute, but somebody
That's
saw my
okay.
comment. Thank you. I did hear your question. I think after transplant and even while you're waiting in post-transplant, that self-advocacy is extremely important. We rely on our medical professionals every day and they're great. But the thing about it is that many of them, not all, but most of them haven't gone through what you've gone through. And the only way they truly understand is by you advocating for yourself and just communicating to them what you're feeling, what you're seeing. If you're taking a medication that doesn't agree with you, if there's an unwanted side effect, it's important that you speak up and you let them know those things because there's help. An example of that for me was immediately post-transplant, I noticed that one of my anti-rejection drugs was giving me tremors to the point to where I couldn't work. For the first maybe 3 or 4 hours after I took it, there was just like these uncontrollable shakes. And it was only through that conversation with my physician that I learned that there was a better option. For me, it was just simply switching from an immediate release drug to an extended release drug. And then that side effect went away. And quality of life was extremely different when compared to both of them. So I think that going through the process, self-advocacy is a must. It's something that you shouldn't avoid. And it's important to know that it's accepted and welcomed by your healthcare team.
I think that's such a really good point to say it's accepted and welcomed, right? I mean, you are the expert on how you're feeling.
Sure.
The idea that your healthcare providers really are only operating with the information that they can get from their assessment. And a large part of that is going to be asking you questions.
Sure.
You should always really do your best to be honest with your providers, even if it's maybe negative feedback, because that is something to maybe that could maybe be fixed. Karen, were you going to say something?
I just really think that probably the most important thing about any of the medical stressors is making sure that you have open communication with your nurses and your doctors, and that you ask questions, and Amber mentioned this, and making sure that you really understand what it is they're telling you. And if you're curious about something or concerned about something, it's very important that you let them know that. Because they can help you to understand what's going on, and that right away eases some of the stress.
That's a really good point. I think when we think about potential stressors after transplant, first and foremost, the idea that the transplantation itself is quite a major undertaking. It's a very big surgery. For some people, they're only hospitalized for a matter of days. For others, a lengthy recovery, sometimes requiring a return to the operating room, prolonged hospitalizations for medical care. This can be a stressor that is not uncommon. Kind of going down the line, thinking about medicines and the side effects like you touched on, Amber. And I know, Karen, you had shared that was also an issue for you, the tremors in the initial post-transplant phase.
One of the things that we found was that because Jim and I are retired, that helped us a lot because I was able to totally depend on him. And he stepped up to the plate and took care of a lot of things that I think are probably hard to ask people for help with.
Sure.
The trimmers, we did sippy cups. That was my first step to actually being able to do some things for myself, because I had the trimmers so badly that I couldn't brush my own teeth. I couldn't feed myself. And I jokingly talked to the doctors about, it says in the little binder that we're going to have tremors, but these are not tremors, these are earthquakes. And learning that doing your best and you might not be able to do some things for yourself, and recognizing that when you ask someone to help you, they may not help you quite the way that you expect. And you need to relax about that. You need to let them help you. And Jim and I had this conversation because he would say, if you're asking me for help, you need to allow me to help you the way that I want to, not the way that you want me to. And that was one of the stressors for us, is because I had certain expectations. When I asked for help, I didn't realize that I was asking for him to help me exactly the way that I wanted to be helped.
That's
And
really
after we discussed that, it became easier for us to work through that.
So that's something good for care partners to know too. The idea that as a care partner, you should try to advocate for that role as well. The idea that if you're going to be partnering with someone and helping them, it has to be working for everyone involved.
Yeah.
I think transplantation too, it's not unfair to say that there is maybe a lingering fear also that exists in the post-transplant realm, that that this is a good treatment and it's going well, and or even if they're not, the idea that the fear of rejection and other diseases are also can kind of create challenges. Amber, you shared that a little bit about something that's really kind of particular to the kidney population, the idea of CMV compatibility, and how that was kind of a medical stressor for you right in the beginning.
Yeah, it was. It was a medical stressor, honestly, even prior to transplant, because this was something that was brought to me the day that they made an offer to even have a kidney, that this was a situation where my donor was CMV positive and I was CMV negative. And what that meant for me was that after transplant, at some point, I would also become CMV positive, and then we would have to work through that process of making sure that my kidney was protected and that I would be protected. So for those that don't truly understand what CMV is, it's very similar to what you would call the chicken pox, not the same thing. Nothing that necessarily lingers, but nevertheless has to be dealt with should you test positive for CMV after transplant. And I think that when it comes to those fears for BCMV or even rejection, that education is the key. Educating yourself. If your fear is rejection, whatever organ that you receive, just understanding how that happens, how to know that you could potentially be in rejection. And then again, having whatever fear that you have, having that discussion with your medical team to make sure that you truly understand all the ramifications around that fear. And it was the same for me for CMV. I immediately went and educated myself on CMV. I had that discussion with my healthcare team. They explained to me that this is something that they see. They told me exactly what would happen, and it did, that it would come, between this day and this day, once we take you off your antifungal drugs, and here's how we're going to treat it. And they did exactly that. And we treated it. It went away. I was CMV negative after a week or so, and I haven't heard from it since. So there are things that are going to happen. Transplant is a major surgery. The surgery is not always peaches and cream, but it is absolutely a wonderful treatment option once you get over that hump.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I think we'll talk a little bit more about the CMV complications down the line too. Right. I think the idea that that life keeps going, even though you're transplanted and you've had this surgery, you know, these instrumental demands, the day-to-day life, it still goes. The dog still needs to go out to go to the bathroom. Someone has to clean the house and do the laundry. The kids have to get to school. The bills have to get paid. So the forward movement of life and all these things that need doing, plus the management of a transplant, can be a whole different set of instrumental demands. I'm wondering if you guys had any of these things that were especially challenging or daunting to you, kind of giving up that control of maybe taking care of things around the house or driving, appointment setting, or anything like that.
Amber, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think for me, it was the surgery itself. You know, I got a kidney and I'm ready to go, and not sitting down and wanting to take the time that it takes to truly heal was something that I dealt with along the way. Financial stressors is certainly a thing, even when you have commercial insurance and Medicare that many of us have, and how they work together. Dealing with co-pays and navigating which insurance company pays first, which insurance company pays second is a thing while you're up against your transplant medication. And that's stressful, right? If an insurance company has me in a process of approval and I realize I only have 5 or 6 days of my transplant medication left, that's a big thing. That's a stressful event. But I think through all of that, you know, returning to work, returning to school, having those conversations with coworkers so that they understand that, hey, you know, I received a kidney transplant 6-7 weeks ago. I'm extremely immunosuppressed. I love you guys. I can't hug right now. Those are just things that you deal with. But again, I think it's more about self-advocating. If you have a question, ask your question. And just communicating, not only with your family and friends, your healthcare team, but everyone around you, and making sure that they just simply understand that while you're feeling better, there's a process.
Absolutely. I'm wondering, Jim, during the immediate post-transplant phase of care, did you notice that you were taking on some of maybe things in the household that were Karen's roles, and how was that caregiving experience for you?
Oh, well, I was lucky because I wasn't going back and forth to the hospital as much as before the transplant. So actually the workload kind of dropped.
Okay.
But that's pretty rare, but she was in pretty bad shape before she went in. So
Yeah.
I think your experience is not uncommon. You know, for some people, the more medically complex time is the time prior to transplant. And for some, it's that initial hospitalization and then after that can be more medically complex. Of course, the goal is for the pre-side to be more medically complex, right?
yeah, one thing that reduced the stress was she got the transplant just before Christmas. So she's in the hospital over Christmas, and it's during COVID. And so I never had to wait for an elevator at the hospital, and I never had to go hunting for a parking space because there's nobody there. They wouldn't let you in.
That is really seeing the bright side of things. I appreciate that.
That's right. And she didn't have to worry about 40 of her family showing up in the room to visit because they only let one person in, me.
So it's a hidden, sometimes it's these blessings in disguise, isn't it?
That's right. It was wonderful.
I think that understanding that the care partner has a great deal of learning and new roles to take on. Kind of like it seems like, though you're kind of an engineering math brain, you probably took to being a junior pharmacist pretty well.
Yeah, I can fill a pill box.
Good. We could maybe have you do a little demo for us sometime.
Just follow directions.
There you go. And I think that's a really good point. The transplant team, their goal is for you to be successful. They want so badly for you to be successful. So you'll be given written instructions, verbal instructions, care partner teaching with your in person, like you said, even during COVID, doing the best to, while no one else was allowed to come visit, to make sure that you're there to get the education you need to take good care of Karen. I think there's a bit of sometimes I talk about the idea that transplant is kind of like Wizard of Oz, like there's all this stuff that's forward facing that people see. And then there's this whole operation going on behind the curtain where the transplant team is trying their best to give you every bit of information that you would potentially need. Sometimes it's an overwhelming amount of information with not always the best context, because you're getting a lot of information and it's like, you'll get there, you'll understand this when it happens. Kind of like Amber with the CMV, like, we'll get there, you'll understand it when you're experiencing it, but it can feel a little foggy. So some of the other things that you guys all touched on, the idea navigating insurance and medication costs. Amber, when that was kind of coming up for you, is that something you were easily able to address?
Well, I'll tell you, I believe in self-advocating. When I need medication, I'm calling everybody. I don't care who it is. And eventually you get to someone who can help, right? Generally, post-transplant, there's a social worker that's there, that's providing services for you. That's a great place to start. And just if you're struggling with, what's the copay on this medication going to be? Is my insurance paying everything that they should be paying? That's where you start. You have a pharmacist that's there for you. And then there are programs that are slated to help you with this process. So the good thing about all the stressors that you can encounter post-transplant, pre-transplant, there's help, right? Yeah. And if you don't know the correct person to help you, your social worker is a great start.
I have to tell you, that makes me laugh. I was a transplant social worker for 8 years, and the amount of phone calls we would get that would be like, just totally lost. How do I navigate this? And you get good at figuring stuff out. And sometimes it just takes knowing the system really well to help you navigate. And a good social worker is kind of like a resource Rolodex and a detective, because we like the challenge of a problem we haven't solved yet. So we'll figure it out.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest stressors that people experience, especially in that right after transplant phase, are a lot of emotional and existential stress. Symptoms of emotional stress are things we're all pretty familiar with. The idea of that heaviness in your chest, increased heart rate, or maybe some anxious feelings, general body aches and pains, and then fatigue. I think it's really important to point out that during your hospitalization after transplant, and in the for many people forever, those steroids you're on are going to really ramp up any kind of feelings of anxiety, stress, or that emotional fatigue. You're going to be a little more of a frayed wire. So if you're more emotional than you're used to, that's very normal and is expected. And so for, the people taking care of you, it's important to remember that there is a secondary element of stress there, that medication really drives that. And then thinking about the idea of existential anxiety really is, by definition, just questioning your existence in kind of space and time. The experience of transplantation is, I've heard from many patients, is really marked by a feeling of powerlessness and kind of that lack of control. And then the idea that, that your new lease on life is also a really difficult time for another family, and for that at the other end of your transplant is someone who had died so that you've received their transplanted organ, which I know was something that you had both touched on as a stressor. Karen, you had shared with me a little bit about that. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Well, I think that the fact that when we got the call, my first reaction was this overwhelming sense of sadness because someone had lost a loved one close to Christmas. And that pretty much followed me through for probably the first year after my transplant. Intellectually, I had no problems accepting the idea of a transplant. But emotionally, recognizing that someone had lost a member of their family, I found that very difficult. And an interesting thing that I did that kind of helped me through that was, and I still do this, when I tell people my story, I ask them if they're prayerful to please pray for my donor family, and if they're not, that positive thoughts would be really appreciated. And somehow that has made it easier for me to accept that particular emotional challenge. Faith-based crisis, we've talked about this, you and I have, that I think holding on to our faith was probably one of the most important things for us, recognizing that my being sick wasn't just about my being sick, but I met people and formed relationships that I would not have had I not needed a liver transplant, and that those are positive things that came out of my being sick. And I think that Jim was probably under more stress than I was because he handled so much of the load. I mean, he just stepped right in and did everything that I needed someone to do. And recognizing that I could only do so much, and that as long as I did my best, that was okay. So I didn't blame myself for the disease. I had hereditary MASH. My mother passed away from it in 2000. My grandmother died of it in 1998. And so I didn't have that blame thing. And I didn't have to return to work, so that wasn't an issue for me. I don't think I was fearful about the future. I felt so much better the morning after my transplant because I had been so ill before that I just felt really encouraged. And so a lot of the potential emotional and existential stressors, I really got to skip over.
That's good. I'm glad. I think that it's important to note that the things we're discussing today are not one size fits all or guaranteed to even affect everyone. I think what we're looking at is a wide breadth of possibilities.
Yes.
And that not everyone's transplant experience is going to be exactly the same. There's a lot of very common themes. If things are going well and your team is, keeping you on track, things should have the same sort of flow. But everyone's individual life experiences, their situations with support, friends, family, demands on them, it's all going to create a very different picture of what's stressful and what's not. And sometimes these things that are like really good outcomes can also have like that negative flip side. Amber, you had kind of said that finally food tasted good again, which was such a really nice thing, but then that has its own side effect too, where you really have to, it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Tell me about it. It is. And it becomes an emotional stressor as well, because the weight gain will affect your gift, your organ. But that's so true. It stems far beyond the things that you have here, and everybody's so different. I'm sure there's people who food is not a thing, diet is not a thing after the fact. For me personally, it was. And then there are certain things that are going to be very unique to the type of organ you get. I'm a kidney. I received a deceased donor organ. And struggle with the same thing that Karen spoke of, just understanding that even now that I'm here today because someone else's story ended so soon. But unique to the kidney and sometimes the liver, not everyone that is on the list is going to receive a deceased donor, right? There are kidney people who are going to have a living donor, and that's equally as stressful. Not something that I experienced, but I've mentored a lot of people through Gift of Life in my 7 years post-transplant, and it always comes up. It always comes up as friends and family members are going to be tested as potential living donors to a person and how they feel about that. How do you ever repay somebody for giving you the gift of life, 5 years from now, 6 years from now? Am I always going to be in debt to that person? So there's so many things that there's a generic list, and then there are things that are going to be unique to an individual and then unique to the organ that you receive.
Yeah, I think that's such a really good point and such a interesting way to think about it and frame it. I'd not heard people comment the idea that like, okay, well, I'm 5 years out. Now, can I feel pure relief, or do I still have this feeling of the kind of background, maybe guilt? And I think it almost, to me, feels like a bit of a grief thing,
Right.
where in that immediate post event, whether it's a loss or a big gain, it's going to be really acute feelings during that time. And then as life goes on and you adopt this different way of life with this new part of you that was formerly part of someone else, that acute feeling of guilt or grief kind of hopefully dissipates with time, and you find a way to cope with it. I think
Yeah. I think you cope. I don't think it dissipates with time. I'm 7 years post-transplant. Every time I go get labs, I'm nervous. That waiting on results is real, right? Not just for myself. There are donor families that keep up with their recipient to know that if something were to happen to your organ or rejection, that information is shared with them can be devastating. Especially a living donor. Sometimes rejection is beyond our control. It's nothing that we did. It's a part of the process. And just knowing that, hey, I want to do well. I want my donor family or living donor to know that I'm doing well. And just waiting on those results and making sure, or just being hopeful that you don't have, or someone doesn't have to share the news with your living donor or deceased donor family that your organ is not doing well is also stressful within itself.
Absolutely. And I think especially for someone as young as you,
Yeah.
We had a gentleman in our last talk, Wes, who had received lung transplants, and he had known since he was 3 that this was going to be part of his life. And I wonder sometimes about patients that are, it's important to acknowledge the idea that some people need more than one transplant in a lifetime. And that is kind of can be, again, that bit of a dark cloud, that constant grief of a quote unquote normal health picture. So I think it's really interesting for you to touch on and really make the clarification that it doesn't fade with time. You just learn to like walk with it, and it just exists with you.
Sure.
We've talked a lot about stressful things, and I think that I'm glad we are addressing the stressful things. But I want to make sure that we give some thoughtfulness to coping. I think that it's interesting when I talk to people, whether it was as a social worker or now, one of the main things I ask new mentees is, well, when you have stressful things in your life, what are some of your natural coping skills? What are some of the things that bring you relief? And because I think when you're matching someone up with a mentor, it's important that if someone seeks relief from going trail running, they might not, relate to someone as well who likes to lay on the couch and read a book when they're overwhelmed. These are, for as many people as there are, there's different sets of very workable coping skills. Some of the things are going to really require things like real problem focused coping, really drilling down on what's going on and trying to address it. We're going to talk about some instances where that's appropriate. The idea of emotion focused coping. Some of these things are, like we have touched on, really well outside our control. And so if we can't solve the problem, we need to learn to live with the problem. Or the challenge, I should probably say. And then of course, it's important to acknowledge the poor coping skills as well, even if for nothing else than to realize that every day we live with choices. And even if I hear a lot of patients say, well, going back to, doing this or that, that's not an option for me. And it's important to acknowledge that it is an option and you've just not chosen that option. So you are, actively doing things, even if you don't really realize it, kind of in the forefront. So we'll briefly touch on some of these dysfunctional coping skills. I think self-blame is one that people with chronic illness get into a lot, especially if their disease process is in any way exacerbated by their behavior, as almost every disease process is, whether it's diet, lack of exercise, drug use, former smoking or bad habits. These are all things that we can kind of feel guilty about for a long time if we don't let ourselves, evolve. The self-distraction, Amber, you had expressed that sometimes you'd try to distract yourself or avoid thinking about things, and it really just crept up on you anyhow.
Yeah, that's true. I think one of the biggest mistakes, at least I did in the beginning when coping with some of those stressors, was just ignoring emotions and hoping that it would go away.
Yeah.
And that only leads to bigger issues, which then, impacts your gift of life, the organ that you received, because ignoring those emotions, at least for me, was kind of like sleeping too much, overeating, sometimes undereating, and all of those things have a negative impact on your organ. So I learned pretty quickly that ignoring emotions is not the way to go, right? You have to do something different and learn how to positively cope with those emotions that you're feeling.
Jim, I'm wondering, you and Karen, I think my experiences with you have really been marked by a lot of positivity. I wonder if there was ever a time when you all struggled to remain positive with that ebb and flow of feeling very relieved to have a transplant, but also, the stress of the new lifestyle.
I think Karen got stressed most with me when I wanted to show everybody the 44 metal staples across her stomach.
Yeah.
Because I knew time was short. Those were going to come out pretty soon. And, then the opportunity would pass. So.
Sure.
Okay. This is probably the biggest coping skill that we had.
Humor.
Jim is funny. And he made me laugh every day, even on the days when I didn't really feel like laughing. And he's been doing this for 53 years, so it doesn't get any better. He just keeps
So two things there. Humor is important, and also letting your loved one kind of just cope in their own way sometimes, right? Even if it is not our favorite.
Right.
Yeah. But I'm serious about the positive attitude and humor. I think those were two of the most important things. And then I think the very most important thing was just being prayerful about things, recognizing that we could only do the best we could do. And as far as really feeling like down, we have a rule. You can feel sorry for yourself for 37 seconds and then that's it. You need to move on. You need to get over it. And so it's okay to admit that you're really frustrated and that you're sad or that you're really uncomfortable, but you only have a limited amount of time and you don't get to wallow in that. And that's just a rule that we have.
I wanted to point out that someone commented in the messages that they had 39 staples, but not anywhere that they would show off to people. So maybe Jim, you and Karen had a special scenario where it was in a public viewing space, or it was a
Not really.
So it was in your tummy, right?
Only when I lifted her shirt up.
Well, that's probably a nuisance, isn't it?
Yeah.
I cannot take him out in public unless I'm really embarrassed.
Well, I think it's important that you guys, it's the idea of finding the fun and finding the positivity in a space where it can feel really intimidating and scary. Being able to keep the positivity where you can is, like you said, it's a real game changer. The idea of problem solving is something we've been touching on a lot, especially when we've been talking about the idea of self-advocacy. I think when, we're thinking about a lot of these problems that you all have experienced throughout transplantation, whether it's, okay, I'm running low on meds, like Amber said, and it's Thursday and I have 5 days left, and oh my goodness, here we go into the weekend. Choose the problem, figure out how you're gonna tackle it, and work the plan. Karen, you kind of commented that you and Jim are both really problem solvers by nature. Did you find that to be helpful, or is there anything particular about problem solving that any pearls of wisdom you'd want to share?
I think in terms of problems, admitting that there is a problem, and sometimes that's really hard to do. And once you've made that admission, then talking it through for yourself or with each other if it's going to take both of you to solve that problem. But I think that because we just do that on a regular basis, that when it came time for us to go through the transplant process, that just came as second nature for us, and it wasn't something that we had to sit around and think about.
Yeah.
I would like to say that if we weren't normal problem solver approach to life, that we would have at least given that some thought prior to the transplant. And I think that talking about the transplant before you have it, I think it's really important to clarify some things, because you're going to run into problems. Some of the problems that Amber mentioned, like the medications, we didn't have that. We had an amazing pharmacist, and they were on top of everything, and they made calls to us long before we needed anything to double check and see where we were. And so I think we had amazing teams. Our medical team from top to bottom was really on things. And Jim is a very good instruction follower. And if he doesn't understand the instructions, he will ask. He's also a massive note taker. And so he had a lot of notes, and those were useful for us when we got away from the people that were trying to help us and keep us on track.
Yeah, it was a real advantage to be able to walk in to a appointment and tell the doctor or nurse, well, yeah, 7 days ago when we were here, you said thus and so, and I had my notes in front of me, and I kind of established that up front, and they pretty much knew that's the way I operated. And also, I made a 3-ring binder. It was about 3 inches thick, and had a the daily drug dose sheet for every single day for 3 or 4 months. And I hauled that around with us to every appointment, and they'd say, well, when did you go off the Humpty Dump drug or whatever? When did we switch you to something? And I'd just turn to that page in the log notebook and go, oh, right here on this day. Matter of fact, the last one she took was at 8:30 in the morning on this day. And
really highlights the importance of being an educated consumer of what's going on, making sure that you're as knowledgeable to the extent that you can be, and also, again, kind of advocating for yourself and asking the medical professionals, you know, what's going on, but then realizing that a good deal of the responsibility always remains yours. Making sure that you're clear about what you're supposed to be doing and when. That's a really important point to make. I think
Yeah,
that oh, go ahead.
Karen didn't have her hearing aids yet at that point.
Yes.
So I had to go to every appointment to hear what was going on.
Right.
And then would share the notes with her, or she'd read my lips later. But she could do that at home, but we were always masked up because of COVID, and she couldn't read lips.
Sure.
There you go.
There you go.
That was probably the highest stress thing we did was
Yes.
she couldn't hear and she couldn't read lips. So there you go.
I think that some of those things always really do present a challenge. And, you know, I think that definitely when you leave the hospital, and usually when you leave your doctor's office, you're given written instructions about any changes to your medicines or things like this. So even people with deficits or disabilities are able to really participate well in their care. I think another advantage of the times and technology are these portals. You're able to communicate directly and immediately with your healthcare team. Amber, is that something you utilize?
I do. Portals directly, email to and from my nurse practitioner. I absolutely do. I use every resource that's available to me when it comes to making sure that I'm taking the best care of my organ.
The nice thing about the portal too is if you're anxious about those test results, kind of like you said,
They come through very quickly. They do.
You don't have to wait for
You do
anybody
not
to
have
call
to
you.
wait.
You get
That's
them
true.
immediately.
You
So
get
that's
them
always
immediately.
really nice.
It is. Yeah, certainly true.
Someone had asked, Karen, how old were you when you received your transplant?
I was 68.
68. And Amber?
Oh gosh. I was 29.
29. Okay.
29. I was 29.
Hey, Patty, before I forget, you mentioned that they send you home with written instructions.
Yeah, typically.
And yeah, you've got a doctor in there in the appointment, and he's got a nurse or some kind of assistant who's kind of listening, kind of taking notes.
Yeah.
But it was my experience that there was always one or two things the doctor had said that didn't get put down in the notes they handed you afterwards.
Is that right?
And so I always compared my own notes with what they handed me going out the door.
And that's probably what'll keep, I think it's one of those things where everybody's doing their best, but being a good, diligent note taker and really an educated consumer of healthcare is so important. Utilizing your resources to, whether it's something as simple as asking a question and saying, hey, you had mentioned this about when I could get back to work, but it's not in the notes. What's the follow-up on that? And I think it's okay to ask questions, and providers far and away will be very welcoming of that kind of feedback. I think that that's important, Jim, to realize that not everything makes it in the notes. And so there's still a great deal of listening and paying close attention during those appointments. I think that we've talked a lot about the idea of stress and kind of the burden of stress. And a lot of that is, a lot of it can be solved through problem solving, but some of these things, given just the nature of health and of life, it all can be very out of control in very good ways and bad ways. That some of the best surprises in life are really nice things. something that you both mentioned is kind of the refrain in the transplant community that your experience has been greatly affected by the knowledge of your new lease on life and in its relation to the death of someone else. I wondered, have you, either of you had the opportunity to communicate with your donor family, or is that something that you find helpful or beneficial? Amber, I'll ask you first.
I have not had the opportunity to speak with my donor family. I have written them. I have written them twice and I have not received a response back from them. But even though I did not receive a response back, it was extremely beneficial for sure. I kind of viewed it somewhat as a therapy to kind of coping with those things. And I have become very involved in the transplant community, especially around Transplant Gangs of America and getting the opportunity to meet other donor families. And one of the things that I hold on to is that oftentimes it may be years before a donor family has reached the point where they're able to communicate back with you. And that's okay. And if they never communicate back, that's okay because they've done enough. But I do think there is therapy in writing to your donor family. If that's something that you really want to do, it has been a way to help with coping for me.
I think that's such a really poignant thing to say, that you don't have any expectation or demand on your donor family because you feel they've done enough. That's really such an excellent way to put that. Karen, have you had the opportunity or the desire to interact with your donor family?
I have reached out twice, and as Amber mentioned, I have not heard back from my donor family. But again, my whole feeling on that is that if and when they want to reach out, I will be here and I will be ready for that. But I certainly don't feel like they owe it to me to respond. I admit to hoping that they do at some point. I want them to see what their gift has done for me. I mean, I get to travel with my husband. I get to see my grandchildren. Those are things that, there was a point where we wondered whether I would make it to transplant or not. And I don't know, I would like for them to reach out. And if they don't, then they don't. They've already reached out in a tremendous, absolutely priceless way.
Yeah. I think you've also both highlighted the idea of appreciation through faith. And I think that is a powerful thing to kind of touch on as well. Amber, I want to give you an opportunity to share how you've used faith as a coping skill, whether it's during transplant or other stressful times.
Yeah, I always have. And I admit to probably not making it through without my faith and without prayer. I think that if that's something that you believe in, is absolutely another way to help you cope with all of these things. And it's a way to help you manage stress. Just asking and praying for peace will bring about a change. And it certainly brought about a change for me as I went through the process, and it continues to bring about a change as I, get into year 7, year 8, and hopefully year 50 with my organ. I think you're muted, Patty.
And then Karen's same kind of question. I wondered if you would kind of share your experience with your faith-based coping, because I think that's such a common theme.
Well, I mentioned earlier that one of the things that I do is when I tell my story, and I think it's important that we tell our stories, that people recognize that we have been gifted a huge miracle. We get a million miracles a day, but Amber and I both had a huge, huge miracle, and I think it's important to share that. But in asking people to pray for my donor family, or at least to send positive thoughts, I think that lets people know how much I appreciate and I'm aware that this is a huge miracle. And I shared this story with you, and I'm going to do it really quickly, but we were in a restaurant, and because of my liver, I have to ask for my food to be extremely well cooked. I have to have my eggs over extra hard and my bacon extra crisp. And I had asked the server to make sure that the kitchen got those requests. And I said, and I'm not really just a crabby old lady. I need this because I'm a liver transplant recipient. And she kind of got teary-eyed and she said, sure, not a problem. And she left. She came back a couple of minutes later and she was very teary-eyed. And she said, you have no idea what it means to me that you asked me to pray for your donor family. Her 16-year-old daughter had been in an automobile accident and died 3 months before that, and they had donated several organs. And she said, to know that a stranger would ask for our prayers for my family just was really, really something that she said, I had to call my husband and share. She said, it means so much as a donor family. And I just, that kind of solidified for me. And I mean, this was just last summer. And so a year and a half out from my transplant, and that it meant that much to someone who had been a member of a donor family. And so, I mean, I think that just increased my faith more.
I think that that's such a important thing to remember too, whereas both of you have attempted to reach out to your or you've reached out, you've done your part to reach out with your donor family and not receive that word back, you know, that these things they kind of find a way to boomerang back to us and maybe give you a sign in a way that those prayers are being heard somewhere, and they're, you know, they obviously reached someone that it needed to reach, which I think is really special. Just shows that, you know, spreading that awareness and being open and honest about your experience. I think that that is just a really big part of, you know, being a consumer of a transplant. It's almost like a little bit of an extra responsibility to share that that's, you know, a big part of a lot of people's lives. Before we wrap up and say thank you, I just want to check in with both of you and see if there's any additional maybe pearls of wisdom you want to share about, you know, if there was an overarching takeaway you would give, or a 1-minute pitch about coping with transplant, maybe what that would sound like. Jim, I'm going to make you go first this time.
What, me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, your slide on the screen right now, 9 ways to manage stress. I do all those all the time except the yoga.
Yeah.
But I do go to a rock climbing gym. So
That's
my
stretching.
substitute for yoga.
Close.
Yeah.
There you go.
There you go. And always keep your sarcasm level up.
At a high level. I'm picking
High
that
level
up
of
from you, and
sarcasm
I'm
is very
enjoying
good.
it.
That's right.
And I have a quick thing about control. I got to the point where I felt like there was absolutely nothing in my life that I was controlling, except I walked in and saw myself with bed hair, and I thought, I don't have to have bed hair. So I went and got a buzz cut, and I kept my head in a buzz cut for 2.5 years because it eliminated bed hair. And that's a tiny little thing, but I cannot tell you how much that helped me.
The day we left the hospital, we went straight down the hill to my barber, and she got the buzz cut.
I think that that's really fun and a really good point, though. Even in times where it seems like things are very out of control, if you can find something even small to control, it can give you a really good grounding.
Anything.
It also helped that we're both CDO. That's kind of like OCD, but in alphabetical order, like it's supposed to be.
I do like that. Amber, anything you would want to share?
I would just encourage that shared decision making with your team, being open and honest with your conversations, whether you are pre-transplant or post-transplant. That's going to be very, very, very important. just understanding that the stressors are going to be there, and that's a normal part of the transplant journey, and finding positive ways to cope with those stressors will aid you and help you in being good to your organs so that it can be good to you long term.
Well, first, I just want to take a minute and say thank you to all the participants and for really sharing so openly about a time that is really can be very intimate and personal and private. I appreciate so much your willingness to share your experience, and both through mentorship and through today's conversation. In a few months, we're going to be having our next conversation, which is going to be surrounding a lot about the idea of seeking a living donor, because we've had a lot of inquiries about that. So that'll be our next topic in a few months. So keep an eye out in all of the Gift of Life literature for that. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we will hopefully hear from you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, Patty.